So what we are seeing here is that South Sudan could become a black hole, drawing all these neighboring countries into what could become a potential regional conflict.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. South Sudan is the world's youngest country, and it's been troubled from the start. After decades of struggle, the country broke free from Sudan in 2011, gaining independence with the support of the United States, Europe, and most Western powers. But soon after independence, the troubles began. Political rivalries intensified, as did competition over oil resources. Meanwhile, vain political leaders prioritized their personal fortunes over the good of the country. South Sudan was soon torn apart. A brutal civil war killed some 400,000 people from 2013 to 2018 when a peace agreement was signed. But that peace agreement is now rapidly unraveling. Last week, the International Crisis Group issued a rare alert, warning that the country was on the precipice of a renewed, full-blown civil war. This is partly a consequence of the conflict north of the border in Sudan, which is spilling over both into the territory and the fraught politics of South Sudan. Joining me for an in-depth conversation about what is happening in South Sudan is Daniel Akech Thiong, an analyst at the International Crisis Group. We discuss concerning events over the last several days that suggest an explosive conflict is imminent, some of the underlying drivers of this conflict, and how the civil war in Sudan is exacerbating the situation. We also explore what can be done to pull South Sudan back from the brink. The spiraling crisis in South Sudan is certainly not getting the attention it deserves, but one of the key missions of this show and of my work is to shine a spotlight on those very stories. I learned a lot from this conversation. I know you will as well. This is one of those episodes that makes what we do here at Global Dispatches so unique, and I hope that you will help us continue this work. We need your support. Please go to globaldispatches.org and get a paying subscription to help us keep the lights on, to help us keep doing what we do. Each individual subscription goes a very long way to making this show sustainable. We're facing some funding challenges, and we rely on crowdfunding more than ever. You can also get a paying subscription directly in the Apple Podcasts app. Please do whatever is most convenient for you. Thank you for your support. Now, here is my conversation with Daniel Akech Thiong of the International Crisis Group. So, Daniel, we're going to be speaking about the unfolding situation in South Sudan today, which now is on the brink of a full-blown civil war. Your organization, the International Crisis Group, wrote an eye-popping piece and warning that we really are on the precipice of a major catastrophe. So that's what I wanted to discuss with you today. Just a little bit of some quick background for viewers and listeners. South Sudan got its independence from Sudan in 2011 and was fairly troubled from the start. From 2013 to 2018, there was a really horrific and brutal civil war in which an estimated 400,000 people were killed, over 4 million people displaced. The war, which erupted between forces loyal to President Salva Kiir and his main political rival, Riek Machar, it was marked by severe ethnic violence, mass atrocities, famine, all the most horrible things. A peace deal was signed in 2018 that brought Machar back into the government as vice president, That peace deal was always fairly tenuous, but now seems to be unraveling at a rapid pace. To kick off, Daniel, and we'll discuss the deep drivers of this conflict, can I just have you describe recent events this month that have you and your colleagues so concerned about a resumption of full-scale civil war? What's been happening recently?
It started last month when the tension between the two leaders started growing bad, when Machar, the vice president, was complaining to the presidents that some of the changes the president was making were violating the terms of the agreements. And then in February 25th, the local militias based in Nasser, one of the towns in one of the states in South Sudan, state called Upper Nile, they start complaining, saying that the forces that were in the area should have been changed with unified forces because South Sudan forces split when the civil war happened in 2013. That request had not happened. And then when the president made a decision to try to redeploy forces, they start protesting on the ground. This was the end of February. On March 4th, those armed militias attacked the garrison town, the government town, and overran the government base in Nasser. And then situation of hostage started developing where the commander of the base put himself in a tank. And then the negotiation started where the leaders in Juba and the UNMISS, the UN in Juba, started to dialogue with these forces to allow this commander to be lifted. On the 7th, what happened in that process of attempting to rescue this general, it failed as the helicopter came under fire on the ground and the general was killed along with the UN personnel.
Yeah, these were UN helicopters, UN peacekeepers that were seeking to try to reduce the potential for escalation here by rescuing that stranded general. But the helicopters were shot out, the general was killed, peacekeepers were killed.
Yes, Nasser now is under the control of those armed militias. And these militias were in the previous civil war were affiliated with the vice president Machar. And that's how this connects to the politics happening in Juba. And that's where things stand. Tension is still high in Nasser. There are two ways this thing could go. Either the government will try to retake the town from these people, the locals, or the locals themselves could mobilize to move on a much bigger city closer by called Malakal, one of the three main cities in the country.
So, I mean, as you're describing it right now, it sounds like the situation is a tinderbox in which you have this militia that is aligned with Riek Machar. That militia might go on the offensive, or the government forces aligned with Salva Kiir might go on the offensive to try to retake this captured town. And is there any sort of international intervention happening right now to try to de-escalate the situation?
One of the regional bloc called the IGAD in the region has been visiting Juba and trying to talk with both parties to de-escalate the tensions. The biggest problem now is really the dialogue between the two leaders that has been decreasing, and that is really dangerous. Also, we should not forget that it's not only where the violent spikes was seen recently in Nasser that is the problem. Juba itself is also a problem because when the two parties, the president Salva Kiir and Vice President Riek Machar, came together in 2020 to form the unity government, the coalition government, the forces were not integrated. So Machar has forces not far away from Juba. And so that is also another flashpoint where either the government forces loyal to Kiir could also make moves on these forces that are in three different bases close enough to Juba.
And Juba is the capital. So this could really explode at any time. You have two rival armies and two men competing for power over the country. Frankly, it sounds a lot about like what's happening to the north in Sudan, which we'll get into in a minute because I know there are linkages there. Could you just briefly give us a history of Salva Kiir and Riek Machar and their fraught relationship?
The relationship has been largely negative because back when they joined the Southern Rebels movement, they rose in ranks. And then in the 90s, the rebels fought among themselves. And that was the beginning of Machar being on one side, Kiir being on the other side. And then when they signed the peace agreements in 2005, South Sudan was given some time to prepare, to exercise some referendums to decide whether they would remain part of Sudan or it would break away. This happened in 2011, and President Kiir became the president, and Machar was his deputy. The relationship started to break. 2 years later, South Sudan went into war, pitting Machar versus Kiir. And this war has been, they made attempts to try to stop it in 2015, and that peace agreement also broke down. And then this was the second attempts to try to bring them together. So the relationship between two of them has always been negative. And when it gets to that level, when the tension is high between them, they both run back to their ethnic basis to try to drag in their forces, because that's where they are able to get fighters from. The president is from an ethnic group called Dinka, which is the largest in South Sudan, and Vice President Riek Machar is from the Nuer, which is also the second largest. There are also other ethnicities in South Sudan. It's a country of almost 64 different ethnic groups. So that has been the relations. It's always, when they disagree, it involves some kind of mobilizations along tribal lines.
And that's part of the reason we saw such horrible ethnic violence in the first massive civil war from 2013 to 2018. And so again, it's the potential for mass atrocities against civilians that has, I think, so many of us so deeply concerned, should this really tense situation, as you describe it right now, with forces really on the brink of mobilizing, should that come to be, it could get like really ugly really fast. So one of the most important external dimensions has to do with oil. So South Sudan has a lot of oil. Sudan does not have very much oil. South Sudan does not have access to a port. So the oil that is from South Sudan goes via Sudan to the port of Sudan. With the civil war ongoing in Sudan, the oil revenues that are the lifeblood of the South Sudanese government have dropped precipitously. What has been the effect of declining oil revenues on stability in South Sudan?
That has been huge. The pipelines were shut down due to the war in Sudan for more than a year now. It was February last year. The government of South Sudan was relying on these revenues. 90% of its revenues were coming from this oil. So it made this large government that came together. It's a government that was formed with one president, 5 vice presidents. So it's a bloated government. And it was the glue that was holding it together was this oil revenues.
Yeah. And the oil revenues is like used as patronage, right? To kind of keep those vice presidents happy and their networks happy. They shared the spoils.
Exactly. So this has made it difficult for the president to exert control. One of the direct consequences was that he realizes that he was losing control over the security sector. So he started to, since late last year, to try to restructure, to exert control in the security sector. And that process actually led to what we are seeing today. That he started by firing his long-serving intelligence chief in October last year, and then he followed that with security advisors, other government officials, until this actually gotten out of hands. And when the president started firing people from his partner in peace, Riek Machar, and this created the tension we are seeing. So that's one. People have also been feeling that the presidents might be trying in this process, trying to create a government of people more loyal to him, and that this fiscal crisis that is happening, in this process, he has also weakened himself by dismantling the security that he has always used. And that is creating more fear. And the kind of reaction we're seeing are out of that, where the president is feeling more insecure. And this has led to him inviting Ugandan forces into the country, which is also another dimension linked to this, because Sudan is benefiting when the oil is flowing through its land to the world market. The South Sudanese oils, Sudan get paid for transport, transit, and other infrastructural benefits that they get out of being the main channel for the South Sudanese oil. And then Uganda, although it's a landlocked, is also benefiting from South Sudan because the South Sudanese have not been developing their economy. So they rely on imports from Uganda. So South Sudan is an export destination for Uganda. And that's why when there's stability, South Uganda is always linked. Now, when the Ugandan forces are coming into Juba, this could embolden the presidents to pursue escalation as opposed to de-escalations. And that's part of the angles we are seeing. And then when the Ugandan forces also engage in conflicts, say around Juba or in Nasser, which is a town we are thinking the government might make a move to try to take back, that place is too close to Sudan geographically. And that could actually lead to the conflict system in Upper Nile in South Sudan converging with the conflict system in Sudan. And this will also drag in the warring actors in Sudan. So what we are seeing here is that South Sudan could become a black hole, drawing all these neighboring countries into what could become a potential regional conflict. So that is another bigger risk that we could see.
I mean, that's chilling, the dynamic that you describe, in which the conflict in Sudan really is expanding into South Sudan, now bringing in Ugandan forces that are trying to prop up the government of Salva Kiir. Meanwhile, Salva Kiir, with the addition of these Ugandan forces, might be emboldened to strike against Riek Machar because, I suppose he would feel emboldened to do so. And you're talking about an escalating regional crisis. Can you describe, as you do in your excellent Peace and International Crisis Group's briefing on this, like the role of the conflict in Sudan on the actors in South Sudan? We talked about the oil angle, how the conflict in Sudan has disrupted the regular pipeline and the oil flows that the government of South Sudan has long used for like 90% of its government revenues. But in what ways are the opposing forces to the north in Sudan inserting themselves into the conflict in South Sudan?
Part of it is historical, when the southern rebels, who are now the leaders running South Sudan in opposition and part of the ruling groups like this Riek Machar and the President Kiir, when they were as a group fighting against the government in Khartoum, which is now the northern Sudan, the Sudan, what remains as Sudan, various militias were deployed as proxies by the Sudan government to deal with the rebels in southern Sudan. That relations has remained intact, where the government of Sudan has been able to link up when the war broke out in April 2023. South Sudanese joined, some South Sudanese youth were desperate. They were dragged in by their commanders looking for weapons and operating as low-grade mercenaries in that conflict on both sides. So this has built South Sudanese forces inside both sides of the warring parties in Sudan. When the conflicts happen in Upper Nile or in South Sudan, these same forces are moving back in and out of Sudan. They go back to Sudan to look for weapons, and they come to South Sudan. So in a way, this is same system in separate areas that they just walk in and out. So you don't even have to see the Sudanese army. You don't have to accuse them of supplying them, because they already have these militias with them who are now moving in and out of South Sudan, and they are bringing in back the weapons. So the war in Sudan, in a big way, has actually created an influx of illegal arms into South Sudan along a very long border that spans about 4 different states in South Sudan. So this has been building up. Even if there was an arms embargo on South Sudan, this thing has been not effective because of this issue of illegal arms flowing in. And also, when the conflicts broke out in South Sudan in 2013, massive number of people were displaced. 2.5 million people went to neighboring countries as refugees. Sudan itself received almost 1 million of those. When the war broke out in Sudan, these people had to return into this fragile environment. And that has also contributed. South Sudan has received so far 1 million returnees, 1 million people returning from Sudan into this fragile environment. So it's affecting South Sudan in lots of ways. It's bringing this large number of people who need humanitarian emergencies, and South Sudan is not in any way in a position to address those. And then you have these militias moving in and out of South Sudan. And then the last thing is that the South Sudan, when it became independent, there were regions that remain part of Sudan, but they were also fighting with South Sudan for autonomy. They never got that. One
Yeah.
of them was called Southern Kordofan. It's a region there. There is Darfur, which is also a region, and there is Eastern Sudan. In Southern Kordofan, there is something called the Sudan People Liberation Movement North. These groups are aligned with the Southern Sudanese. But now, recently, they joined the war. Last month, there was a meeting here where one of the groups in the warring sides in Sudan came to Nairobi, and this group joined them. So that is dragging South Sudan also into these conflicts because of these groups in Kordofan that is fighting.
Yeah, I mean, so earlier I sort of alluded to some of the similarities between the civil war in Sudan and what's happening in South Sudan. And it seems to me the key similarity is that you have two like very vain men who control armies, who are fighting for control of the country. In Sudan, it's General Burhan and the Sudanese Armed Forces versus Hemedti and the Rapid Support Forces. And from what I gather, the Rapid Support Forces and Hemedti, their leader, are more aligning right now with Salva Kiir, with the president of South Sudan. Is that right?
Yeah, there are two reasons that explains this. One is the South Sudan has been getting closer to the UAE, United Arab Emirates, recently. And the president visited last month for a week to UAE. And then there are also talks of hospitals being built in northern part of South Sudan, in northern Barghazal, which is a state in South Sudan, in a Will area. So that is one. And then the other one is these new alliances between the RSF and groups that have been fighting the government, but they are affiliated with Juba historically. So these two are kind of like pushing Salva Kiir more into aligning with the RSF. But there is a big interest between the South, which is the government, and Juba, which is oil. So they've been trying to actually get the oil flow to resume. And that seems to be one of their key interests holding them together. We don't know what will happen if this still is deteriorations of relations between Port Sudan, which is the headquarters of the Sudan's armed forces, and Juba. The deterioration of their relations is real, but what will they do without oil? Because both need that.
That's fascinating. So even though the government of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, are more aligned with RSF, it's just this desperation over oil revenue that is potentially a method of cooperation between President Salva Kiir of South Sudan and General Burhan, the leader of the Sudanese Armed Forces. And again, he controls like the main port that pipeline exits. And of course, that pipeline also goes through RSF controlled territories. So there's always the potential for shenanigans. I wanted to ask you the role of the UN and the United Nations peacekeepers in all this, because there is a large UN peacekeeping force deployed to South Sudan that's been there since the civil war from 2013 to 2018. And back in that civil war, the main role of the peacekeepers was to provide a shelter for fleeing civilians who sought a modicum of safety from the violence. You saw peacekeeping headquarters become massive displaced persons camps. What role are you seeing the UN play right now in this conflict?
The UN could play some role because the security setting in South Sudan has led to some civilians not seeing the government forces as neutral forces. So in a sense that UN could be deployed to some areas and they would be accepted by the locals, especially in places like Nasser. But the context is also pretty challenging for the UN because we have just seen what happened on the 7th of March. That is a UN helicopter coming to the ground. That you would expect these civilians, though they are armed, would respect that. And that we have not seen that. So that is making it very challenging that even if UN is deployed, if what happened in Nasser become the way things operate, then it will be a problem because the UN is also restricted in what they could do. They are there to protect civilians, but then if they are attacked, how are they supposed to do their job? So that is also a big challenge. In Juba, they could be more effective because the leaders are there, so they might be able to provide some protection to some of these leaders. Because in South Sudan now, in Juba, the president is the one providing the security of his rival. And that doesn't always seems to be something could be trusted, especially when the tensions are rising. The president has also arrested a number of officials from the oppositions in Juba. So this is an area where the UN could also help with the dialogue, which is extremely important at this point. The UN could facilitate some of that because it should not be just like the two leaders that are brought to the table, but maybe expanding to include other stakeholders locally, including these forces that are engaging in violence. I'm sure they have leaders who could also be brought to the negotiating table.
So the United States has always been a key player in South Sudan and was, a champion of South Sudanese independence early on. We're now in a situation in which the United States is kind of absent from diplomacy, from dialogue on peace and security issues in Africa. Do you see any connection between that kind of like neglect from a once important diplomatic player in the region and the outbreak or potential outbreak of war today? Or is that just my own myopic view as an American?
It's not your own. It's actually, and the disengagement, to be fair, is not actually the one that is started with the current U.S. administrations. It goes back to the previous ones as well. The U.S. has been frustrated with the leaders in South Sudan because of the heavy investments that has been coming into the country. Financial support, the humanitarian sector was largely supported by the U.S. funding. And that sector was making up about 15% of the South Sudanese economy. So it's a huge thing. But that what it did was it's absolved the government from carrying out its own responsibilities. So somehow it's something that was expected. You get some help, and then you're supposed to fix and use your domestic resources prudently. But that was not happening. So the U.S. has been with South Sudan for a long time. And then by the time this last agreement was signed in 2018, which brought back Machar and Kiir into the same government, the U.S. was watching if there would be some differences, if they would act different this time around. But that was not the case. They extended this agreement 4 times, and they are not implementing it. Like less than 10% of that provisions in that agreement had been implemented. So this became a joke. Like, what are we supporting here? So the U.S. started disengaging, and that, yes, of course, it has some consequences. Once the U.S. is disengaging, it also affects the rest of the international community, but also lack of seeing outcomes. There is no return on the investment that is being made in South Sudan. That has been discouraging for a lot of countries, not just the U.S. The international community is discouraged because what is the way out here? And that is something to blame on the leaders of South Sudan for not realizing that it's their responsibility to provide leadership, because what is happening in South Sudan is a failure of leadership, and that is not to be blamed on external actors. It's the local leaders who carry the blame for that.
So I know it's getting late in Nairobi. I wanted to give you the opportunity to offer any final thoughts, in particular around, more immediate steps that the international community can take to prevent what seems to be a very dangerous situation from escalating even further.
There is need for opening dialogue that should involve all these external actors that are playing dangerous roles, like Uganda, for example, should also be brought to that table because it's now becoming an actor. But communication between Kiir and Machar and what is at stake here is something that needs to be brought to the table, and the international community and the regional leaders could actually do that directly inside Juba. If it doesn't work, they could move it to a neighboring country like Kenya, where there is already a platform in which South Sudanese were trying to negotiate peace deal to bring all the holdout groups back into the government in South Sudan. That platform could still be used to discuss the future of South Sudan, because that is what is at stake now. This violence could threaten disintegrations of the country, and the regional leaders and the international community could actually help in bridging the gap between Machar and Kiir and reducing the tensions, because it's still tense now, the situations.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.